He came out of nowhere, a barefoot little boy, tears mixing with dust, sprinting toward a roaring line of bikers. His tiny hands waved wildly, his voice cracking with terror. "They took my mom!" For a moment, the engines drowned him out, until one man saw the bruises on his arms. What began as an ordinary ride through a small southern town turned into something no one was ready for. A collision between cruelty, courage, and conscience. Because what those bikers discovered next would change more than just one life. The sun was already slipping behind the pine trees when Malik, just 9 years old, chased the last few bubbles drifting from his plastic wand. His laughter echoed across the narrow street of a quiet Alabama town, a sound too pure for a place so burdened by invisible lines. His mother, Renee, stood on their porch, watching him with a smile that tried to hide exhaustion. She worked double shifts at a diner off the highway, polite to customers who never looked her in the eye, careful not to say too much when they did. For Malik, life was small but safe. He loved the hum of his mother's old radio in the mornings, the way she danced to forgotten soul songs while packing his lunch. Every night she promised, "We're gonna get out of here someday, baby. Somewhere better." And Malik believed her, because that's what children do. They believe. The town, however, didn't believe in people like them. Their neighborhood sat on the edge of things, not poor enough to notice, not rich enough to fix. Across the train tracks, there were streets with manicured lawns, clean signs, and people who clutched their purses when Renee walked by. Still, she kept her head high, raising Malik to say, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," even when it hurt to be polite. That Friday evening felt no different. Renee had promised Malik a surprise after work, maybe a slice of pie, maybe a new set of crayons. She never said. She just kissed his forehead and told him to wait at home until she returned. The clock ticked past sunset, and Malik counted the minutes like he always did. But that night, the minutes stretched longer. The radio turned to static. The hum of cars faded. Then came the sound, the sharp squeal of tires somewhere down the dirt road. It wasn't a sound Malik usually noticed, but this one made his chest tighten. He waited for his mother's voice, for the familiar sound of her keys jingling. Instead, he heard shouting, men's voices, rough, angry, echoing off the silence. He ran to the window, but the streetlight flickered weakly, showing only the shadow of a van turning the corner. A piece of fabric, his mother's red scarf, fluttered in the road behind it. Malik's stomach dropped. Something in him knew. He didn't have words for it, only a pounding in his chest that said run. He burst out of the house barefoot, the gravel biting his feet, the night swallowing his cries. The van was already gone, its tail lights a fading blur beyond the trees. Malik stood in the middle of the road, shaking, whispering her name into the wind. Then, in the distance, he heard another sound, deep, steady, mechanical. The rumble of engines. He turned and saw them. A group of bikers cruising down the highway, their headlights slicing through the dusk like streaks of fire. To anyone else, they would have looked terrifying. Leather jackets, tattoos, faces hardened by the road. But Malik didn't see that. He saw people who might help. He sprinted toward them, waving his arms, voice breaking with panic. "Help, please, they took my mom." The bikers slowed. One by one, the engines sputtered quiet. The leader, a tall man with a graying beard, took off his helmet, confusion written on his face. He had no idea that the next few seconds, one frightened boy, one desperate plea, would drag them all into a story that would test everything they thought they knew about race, justice, and mercy. Because in a town that liked to look away, this time, someone finally didn't. The leader's name was Ray Dalton, a man who had spent half his life on the road trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. He'd seen desperate faces before, people stranded, lost, or scared. But this was different. The boy standing before him, shaking, eyes wide with panic, wasn't lost. He'd lost someone. Malik's words tumbled out between sobs. They took her, my mom, in a white van. It went that way. He pointed toward the dirt road fading into the trees. His tiny chest rose and fell so fast it hurt to watch. Ray crouched down, his calloused hands steadying Malik's trembling shoulders. You sure about what you saw, kid? He asked. Malik nodded, his lip quivering. They had masks. I think they hurt her. Ray looked at his crew, a dozen bikers in worn leather, faces that told stories of hard roads and harder choices. Most of them were white. They exchanged uncertain glances, hesitant to get involved. This was the Deep South, a place where people didn't mix, where helping the wrong person could get you branded as one of them. Still, something in Ray's gut twisted. He revved his engine once and said, "We're not leaving a kid out here alone." "Mount up," the group followed, though not all willingly. The night air grew heavier as they rode deeper down the dirt road, Malik clinging to Ray's jacket, his eyes locked on the van's fading tire tracks. The forest seemed to close in around them, shadows stretching like hands across the headlights. Then they saw it. The van, abandoned at the edge of an old junkyard. The door hung open, the back smeared with something dark. Malik froze when he saw the scarf, his mother's red scarf, snagged on the bumper. Ray motioned for the others to stay quiet as they dismounted. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas. They approached the van slowly, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Inside, a few broken bottles, rope, a phone case. Renee's name glimmered faintly on the cracked screen. Ray's jaw tightened. They didn't go far. But before they could search further, headlights flared behind them, a police cruiser pulling up fast. 2 officers stepped out, hands already on their holsters. "What the hell's going on here?" one barked. His gaze landed on Malik, then swept across the group of bikers. "You boys know this kid?" Ray opened his mouth to explain, but the officer cut him off. "Step away from the child," Malik's voice cracked. "No, they took my mom." "Please," the officer ignored him. "Where'd you get this boy?" His tone wasn't curious. It was accusing. The other officer whispered something, eyes narrowing at Ray's jacket, an old patch with a skull and flames. Ray felt heat rising in his chest. "We didn't take him," he said, struggling to stay calm. "We're trying to help him." But the officer's smirk said otherwise. "Sure you are. A gang of bikers with a black kid in the middle of nowhere?" He took a step closer. "You expect me to believe that?" Malik's hands tightened on Ray's sleeve. He whispered, "Please don't let them take me." Ray's blood boiled. He'd been profiled before, judged for the leather, the tattoos, the noise. But this was different. The look in the officer's eyes wasn't just suspicion. It was disdain. The kind reserved for people they never planned to listen to. "Sir," Ray said carefully, "if you just let us—" The officer raised a hand. "Enough. Hands where I can see 'em." Engines still idling behind them, the bikers froze. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then from the woods, a faint sound, muffled, weak, unmistakable. A woman's cry. Malik turned his head, eyes wide. "That's her!" The officers hesitated, but Ray didn't. He moved toward the sound. "Hey," the officer shouted. "Stop right there!" Ray ignored him. He knew that tone. The one that came before the violence, before someone accidentally got hurt. But this wasn't about him anymore. The cry came again, closer now, desperate. Ray pushed through the brush, flashlight shaking. And then he saw it. A figure bound and gagged against a tree, face swollen, eyes pleading. Renee. Behind him, the officers were shouting, radios crackling, tension ready to explode. But Ray only saw one thing. A terrified mother and a boy who refused to give up. what he did next would change everything. Ray's heart slammed in his chest as he knelt beside Renee. Her wrists were raw from the rope, her breathing shallow but steady. Malik's tiny voice echoed behind him, trembling. "Mama?" Her eyelids fluttered open, eyes wet with disbelief. "Baby," she whispered. But before they could embrace, a harsh command cut through the trees. Ray didn't answer. He just looked up at the man, eyes burning with a mix of fury and exhaustion. "You didn't even ask before aiming your gun." The officer swallowed hard but said nothing. The power dynamic hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Renee leaned against Ray's shoulder, whispering, "Thank you." Her voice cracked under the weight of everything she'd endured. The fear, the disbelief, the ugly truth that even rescue came with suspicion. Blue and red lights painted the trees, casting shadows that seemed to breathe. Reporters would later call it a misunderstanding, another headline that softened the edges of what really happened. But in that moment, under the flashing lights and trembling branches, Malik clung to his mother, his small voice barely audible. "Why'd they point the guns at you when you were helping us?" Ray had no answer, only the echo of sirens and the truth that some people didn't get to be heroes, not when the world refused to see them that way. And as dawn broke over the fields, one question hung heavy in the air, a question no one wanted to face. How many more would have to bleed before someone finally listened? The sun rose slowly over the Alabama pines, painting the fields in quiet gold. But for Malik, Renee, and Ray, nothing about that morning felt calm. The flashing lights were gone, the shouting had faded, and all that remained was the hollow stillness that follows chaos. Renee sat wrapped in a blanket beside the ambulance, her face bruised but alive. Malik refused to leave her side, clutching her hand as if letting go would make her vanish again. Ray stood a few feet away, shoulders slumped, blood dried on his sleeve. Reporters had arrived, hungry for details, shoving microphones toward officers who barely knew what to say. They called it a brave rescue, but their words felt cheap, hollow in a place where the truth was more complicated. When the news aired later that night, the story had already changed. The headline said local bikers save abducted woman, but skipped over the part where those same bikers were held at gunpoint. No mention of how the police assumed guilt before asking questions. No mention of the trembling boy who screamed for help while grown men hesitated because of the color of his skin. Renee knew the world would move on. It always did. But she wouldn't. Every time Malik closed his eyes, she could see the fear in his little body, the way he ran barefoot into danger because no one else would come. And Ray carried a different kind of scar. He'd lived long enough to know that what happened in those woods wasn't rare. It was a symptom, one that too many pretended not to see. A week later, Ray stopped by their porch. Malik's laughter returned in small bursts, like a song finding its way back. Renee met him with tears and a quiet, "Thank you." He shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said softly. "Just promise me you'll keep fighting to be seen." For a moment, the silence between them said everything words couldn't. The kind of silence that holds both pain and respect. The kind that comes when two worlds finally meet on equal ground, even if just for a moment. When the local paper finally told the full story, after witnesses came forward, after the truth couldn't be ignored, the town had to face itself. Some pretended shock. Others whispered excuses. But a few, the ones who'd always looked away, started to ask hard questions. Because deep down, everyone knew. If Malik hadn't run toward those bikers that night, his mother might have vanished forever. And if Ray had hesitated, if fear of judgment had stopped him, another tragedy would have joined the silence. In a country where skin still shapes suspicion, where help too often depends on who's asking for it, One child's desperate courage had forced people to see what they'd spent years denying. That night, Malik asked his mother, "Why did they think Mr. Ray was bad when he was helping us?" Renee took a long breath before answering. "Because sometimes, baby, people see what they've been told to see, not what's true." He thought about that for a while, tracing the scars on her wrist. "Then we have to show them what's true." And in that simple sentence, from a boy who had faced fear and hate and still believed in hope, there was something powerful, something pure. Because racism doesn't always roar in headlines. Sometimes it hides in the silence of who we choose to believe, in the hesitation to act, in the comfort of pretending everything's fine. Malik's story wasn't just his own. It was the story of countless others silenced, doubted or dismissed until it was too late. So as the screen fades to black, one question remains, one that lingers long after the video ends. If a child can see the truth so clearly, what's our excuse for still looking away? Step away from her, now! The officers had their guns drawn, flashlights slicing the darkness. The other bikers stood frozen, unsure whether to move or run. Ray raised his hand slowly. "She's the victim," he said. "We found her tied up." But they weren't listening. One officer barked into his radio. "We've got a situation. Possible abduction in progress." Ray's stomach dropped. "They think it's us." Renee tried to speak, her voice breaking. "No, they helped me." But her words came out as a hoarse whisper, drowned by the static of the radio. The officers stepped closer, guns steady, suspicion burning behind their eyes. Malik screamed, "No!" They saved her. "They're the good guys." Still, the barrels didn't lower. One officer turned his glare on Ray. "On your knees. Hands behind your head." Ray felt anger surge through him, not just for himself, but for what this moment represented. A terrified black woman, a crying child, a group of men judged guilty because they looked wrong, because the story was easier to write that way. But before he could comply, a sharp noise snapped through the night, a twig breaking, footsteps rushing behind the cruiser. Ray spun toward it just as two men emerged from the woods, the real kidnappers. Dirty, drunk, one clutching a wrench, the other a pistol. "Ain't your business, old man," one spat. "She shouldn't have run." The officers turned, startled, but too slow. The armed man raised his gun. Ray reacted before thought, lunging forward and tackling him into the dirt. The weapon fired once, a deafening crack that sent birds screaming from the trees. Malik ducked behind a bike, crying out. Renee struggled to pull free, crawling toward her son. The second kidnapper swung the wrench, catching Ray across the shoulder, but Ray fought through the pain, pinning the armed man down. "Drop it," the officer yelled, though it wasn't clear who he was shouting at. The chaos blurred lines. Heroes and suspects merged under the flood of panic and adrenaline. Then, the armed man sneered through bloodied teeth. "You really think they'll believe you? You and him?" He nodded toward Malik. Something broke inside Ray then. Not from rage, but from truth. Because he knew deep down that the man wasn't entirely wrong. The world would question the story, twist it, repaint it in prejudice. Another shot rang out, this one from the police. The armed man crumpled. The second kidnapper froze, dropping the wrench and bolting into the woods. Officers sprinted after him, radios blaring. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ray collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, dirt and blood smeared across his jacket. Malik ran to his mother, wrapping his arms around her as she sobbed into his hair. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop. Sirens distant, headlights flickering, the smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. One officer approached cautiously, hand still near his holster. You weren't lying," he said, voice uneasy.